I never believed in skinwalkers until that night in the Arizona desert. It was summer 2019, and my college buddies Blaine, Gray, and I had decided to go camping near the Navajo Nation border. We'd heard stories about the area, but being typical 20-something guys, we brushed them off as local folklore meant to keep tourists away. We set up camp about 5 miles from the nearest road, surrounded by nothing but red rocks and sparse desert vegetation. The silence out there was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. No traffic, no city noise, just the occasional coyote howl in the distance. As the sun set, painting the desert in deep purples and oranges, we felt like we were the only people left on Earth. The first sign something was wrong came around 11 p.m. We were sitting around our small campfire telling stories and drinking beer when we heard footsteps. Not the light padding of an animal, but heavy, deliberate human footsteps circling our campsite. The sound was distinct. Crunch, crunch, crunch on the dry desert floor. "Did you guys hear that?" Blaine whispered, his voice barely audible over the crackling fire. We all froze, listening. The footsteps continued, maintaining a steady rhythm as they moved in a wide circle around our tent. What made my blood run cold was how measured they were, like someone was deliberately trying to intimidate us. "Probably just a hiker," Gray said, but his voice shook. "Maybe they're lost." The footsteps stopped. For about 10 minutes, we sat in complete silence, ears straining for any sound. Just when we started to relax, thinking whatever it was had moved on, we heard Blaine's voice calling from the darkness beyond our firelight. "Hey guys, come check this out, I found something cool." The three of us looked at each other in confusion. Blaine was sitting right next to me, his face pale in the firelight. But the voice, it was definitely Blaine's voice, with his slight southern accent and everything. It called again, this time from a different direction. "Seriously? You need to see this. Come on." "That's not me," Blaine whispered, his eyes wide with terror. "That's my voice. But that's not me." The voice called out 3 more times, each time from a different location around our camp, forming a triangle around us. It was Blaine's voice perfectly mimicked, down to the way he said "guys," with that slight drawl. But Blaine was right there beside me, gripping his beer so tightly, his knuckles were white. We decided to stay by the fire and wait it out. But around 2 a.m., Gray had to use the bathroom. Despite our protests, he insisted he couldn't wait until morning. We gave him a flashlight and watched as he walked about 50 feet from camp to relieve himself behind a large rock formation. That's when I saw it. In the dim light of our dying campfire, I could make out a figure standing at the edge of our camp. It was tall, maybe 6.5 feet, and it looked exactly like Gray. Same build, same messy brown hair, even wearing the same red flannel shirt. But Gray was behind the rocks, and this figure was just standing there perfectly still, staring at Blaine and me. "Gray?" Blaine called out softly. "That you, man?" The figure tilted its head at an unnatural angle, like a confused dog, but didn't respond. Then from behind the rocks, we heard Gray's actual voice. "What?" "I'm still over here." The figure at the edge of camp turned its head toward the sound of Gray's real voice. In the dying firelight, I caught a glimpse of its face, and my heart nearly stopped. It was Gray's face, but wrong somehow. The features were slightly too sharp, the eyes too bright, and when it opened its mouth, I saw teeth that were too white and too numerous. Without warning, it dropped to all fours and scampered away into the darkness with movements that no human body should be able to make. The speed and fluidity of its motion reminded me of a spider or a lizard. Gray returned a minute later, completely unaware of what we just witnessed. We didn't tell him until we were safely back in civilization. We packed up our camp at first light and hiked back to our car in record time, constantly looking over our shoulders. To this day, I can't explain what we saw out there in the Arizona desert. The locals we talked to afterward weren't surprised by our story. They just nodded knowingly and told us we were lucky we stayed by the fire. They said skinwalkers can mimic anyone perfectly, but they can't cross certain boundaries if you don't invite them in. I've never gone camping in the desert again. Some places are meant to be left alone. I've been hunting alone for over 15 years, and I thought I'd seen everything the Utah backcountry had to offer. I was wrong. Dead wrong. It was late October 2020, during deer season. I'd driven up to the Wasatch Mountains, to a spot I'd been using for years. A remote area, about 3 hours from Salt Lake City, where most hunters don't bother going because of the difficult terrain. I preferred it that way. The solitude was part of the appeal. I'd set up my base camp near a small creek, planning to spend 4 days tracking mule deer through the aspens and pine forests. The first 2 days were normal. I saw some deer sign, heard the usual forest sounds, and enjoyed the crisp mountain air. But on the third morning, everything changed. I was about 2 miles from camp, following what looked like fresh deer tracks through a grove of golden aspen trees, when I heard it. A voice, faint but distinct, calling out from somewhere deeper in the forest. "Help me, please." The voice sounded human, definitely human. Male, probably middle-aged, with a tone that suggested genuine distress. My first thought was that another hunter had gotten injured or lost. In the backcountry, you don't ignore calls for help. It's an unwritten rule. I called back. "Where are you?" "Keep talking so I can find you." The voice responded, still faint but seemingly closer. "Here. I'm here. Please help." I started following the sound, pushing through dense undergrowth and climbing over fallen logs. The voice kept calling every few minutes, always maintaining the same distance, always sounding just out of reach. After about 20 minutes of this, I started to get suspicious. The voice never got closer, no matter how far I walked toward it. That's when I looked down and saw the tracks. In the soft earth near a muddy spot by a small stream, I could see clear impressions in the ground. They started as human footprints, bare feet, which was strange enough in October in the mountains. But about 10 feet later, the footprints changed. They became something else entirely. The tracks transformed gradually from human feet to what looked like large paws or claws. Not a clean transition, but a grotesque morphing. Some prints showed elongated toes, becoming claws. Others showed the heels stretching and changing shape. It was like watching a transformation frozen in mud. I knelt down to get a closer look, and my blood ran cold. The tracks alternated. Human prints, then four-legged animal prints, then back to human, then animal again. Whatever made these tracks had been switching back and forth between walking upright and moving on all fours. "Help me. I'm hurt," the voice called again, this time from a completely different direction. I stood up slowly, my rifle ready, and realized I'd been led away from any recognizable trail. The sun was getting lower and I was deeper in the forest than I'd intended to go. More importantly, I was following something that definitely wasn't human. I decided to head back to camp immediately, but as I started retracing my steps, the voice began following me. It called out every few minutes, sometimes ahead of me, sometimes to my sides, occasionally from behind. Always the same words. "Help me. Please help me." The worst part was how it started to sound more desperate as I ignored it, more pleading. It was using my own human instincts against me, trying to draw me back into the deep forest, where I'd be completely lost as darkness fell. I made it back to camp, just as the sun disappeared behind the mountain peaks. I built up my fire larger than usual and kept my rifle close. Around midnight, I heard branches snapping in the forest around my campsite. Something large moving through the trees, circling me at a distance. Then I saw it. About 50 yards from my fire, at the very edge of the light, I could make out a shape moving between the trees. It was on all fours, but it was too big to be a bear, and moved wrong for any normal animal. The way it crept from tree to tree, staying just out of clear sight, was deliberate and calculated. At one point it stopped and raised what I assumed was its head. Even though I couldn't see details in the darkness, I could feel it watching me. The sensation of being observed by something intelligent and predatory is unlike anything else. Your body knows when you're being hunted. After what felt like hours, the movement stopped, but I didn't sleep a wink. I kept the fire burning bright until dawn and packed up my camp the moment there was enough light to see. I've never returned to that area, and I've never hunted alone since. The locals in the nearby town weren't surprised when I told them what happened. An old-timer at the general store just nodded and said, "Sounds like you met one of the old ones. They mimic voices to lure people away from safety. Good thing you didn't follow it all the way." I still hunt, but only in groups now, and never in areas where I might be too far from civilization. Some things in the mountains are older and more dangerous than any bear or mountain lion, and they're smart enough to use our own compassion against us. My family has always been close, but after the summer of 2021 at that cabin in the New Mexico wilderness, we've never been quite the same. What was supposed to be a peaceful 2-week vacation turned into something that still gives us nightmares. We'd rented a small cabin about 40 miles outside of Santa Fe, deep in the Carson National Forest. The rental listing had emphasized the privacy and seclusion, the perfect escape from modern life, it promised. My wife Gwen, our 2 kids, Emma, 14, and Tyler, 11, and I, were all excited for some quality family time, without Wi-Fi, cell service, or any of the usual distractions. The cabin was rustic, but comfortable. 2 bedrooms, a small kitchen, and a living room with a stone fireplace. It sat in a clearing surrounded by towering ponderosa pines, with the nearest neighbor at least 5 miles away. During the day, it was beautiful and peaceful. At night, it was something else entirely. The first 3 days were perfect. We hiked, played board games, and enjoyed the kind of family bonding that's hard to achieve back home in suburban Albuquerque. But on the 4th night, things started to get strange. I was awakened around 3 a.m. by a scratching sound. At first I thought it might be a branch scraping against the cabin in the wind, but there was no wind that night. The air was completely still. The scratching was rhythmic and deliberate. Scratch, 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 like fingernails being dragged across wood. I got up to investigate, assuming it was probably a raccoon or something similar trying to get into our garbage. But when I looked out the kitchen window, I couldn't see anything. The scratching continued for about 10 more minutes, then stopped abruptly. The next night, it happened again. Same time, 3 a.m. on the dot. Same rhythmic scratching, but this time it seemed to be coming from multiple locations around the cabin. I grabbed a flashlight and went outside to check the perimeter. I found scratch marks in the wood siding, but they were too high up to be from any normal animal. They were about 7 feet off the ground, and they looked like they'd been made by human fingernails, not claws. On the 6th night, the scratching was accompanied by knocking. Not random knocking, but a pattern. 3 slow knocks, pause, 3 slow knocks, pause. It went on for over an hour. Gwen was getting scared and the kids were having trouble sleeping. I called out, "Who's there?" but received no response. Just more knocking. By the seventh night, we were all on edge. Emma had dark circles under her eyes. Tyler was jumpy at every sound. And Gwen kept asking if we should just pack up and leave. I was torn between my rational mind telling me it was probably just a local playing pranks, and a growing sense that something was seriously wrong. That's when I decided to keep watch. I positioned myself in the living room with a clear view of the front windows and the door. I had my camping lantern ready, and my phone to record anything unusual, even though there was no cell signal. Around 2:45 a.m., I heard the familiar scratching start up. But this time, I was ready. I crept to the front window and carefully peeled back the edge of the curtain. What I saw made my blood freeze in my veins. There was a face pressed against the glass, but it wasn't a normal human face. It was elongated and distorted, with features that seemed stretched and wrong. The eyes were too large and too bright, reflecting my lantern light like an animal's. The mouth was slightly open, revealing teeth that looked too sharp and too numerous. Most disturbing of all, the thing was tall enough that its face was level with a window that was a good 7 feet off the ground. I stumbled backward, knocking over a chair, and the thing outside tilted its head at an unnatural angle like it was studying me. Then, slowly, it smiled. The smile stretched wider than any human smile should, showing more of those sharp teeth. I grabbed my lantern and rushed to wake up Gwen and the kids. "We're leaving. Now," I told them. "Pack only what you need. We're getting out of here." Gwen started to protest, but then she looked at my face and saw I was dead serious. We threw our essential items into bags and loaded the car in record time. As we were putting the last suitcase in the trunk, I heard that familiar knocking pattern coming from the cabin. 3 slow knocks. Pause. 3 slow knocks. But now I could see that no one was at the door. We drove through the night, not stopping until we reached a motel in Santa Fe. The kids fell asleep immediately, exhausted from the stress and lack of sleep. Gwen and I sat up talking until dawn, trying to make sense of what we'd experienced. When we contacted the rental company to report what had happened, they were surprisingly understanding. They didn't ask for details and immediately refunded our money for the unused nights. The customer service representative just said, "We've had a few complaints about that particular property. We're considering removing it from our listings." A few months later, I did some research online about the area where we'd stayed. I found several forum posts from other families who'd had similar experiences at cabins in that part of the Carson National Forest. All of them mentioned the 3 a.m. scratching, the impossible knocking, and faces at windows that were too high off the ground. One post that particularly stuck with me was from a local who grew up in the area. He wrote, "That land has been active for generations. The old Pueblo people avoided it, said it was where the skin changers hunted. Modern folks keep building cabins out there, but they never last long as rental properties. Something doesn't want visitors." We never went back to retrieve the items we'd left behind. The rental company sent them to us by mail, no questions asked. To this day, my kids refuse to go camping, and we've never taken another remote getaway vacation. Some places are meant to be left alone, and some things are better left undisturbed. Whatever was watching us from outside that cabin window wasn't human, and I have no desire to ever encounter it again. My girlfriend Lisa and I were driving back from a weekend in Aspen when we encountered something on a mountain road in Colorado that still makes me question everything I thought I knew about the world. It was late October 2019, and we'd decided to take the scenic route back to Denver instead of the main highway. The drive through the Rockies is beautiful during the day, but at night, especially on the smaller mountain roads, it can be unsettling. Miles and miles of dense forest on both sides, winding roads with steep drop-offs, and the constant feeling that you're completely isolated from civilization. We'd been driving for about 2 hours when it happened. It was around 11 p.m., and we hadn't seen another car for at least 30 minutes. The road was a 2-lane mountain highway, curving through pine forests with minimal lighting. Lisa was dozing in the passenger seat, and I was fighting to stay alert after our long weekend of hiking and partying. That's when I saw it in my headlights. About 100 yards ahead, standing directly in the middle of the road, was what I initially thought was a large deer. Colorado has a huge deer population, and hitting one on these mountain roads is a constant concern. I started to slow down, expecting it to bolt into the forest, like deer usually do when they see headlights. But it didn't move. As I got closer, I realized something was wrong. The creature was too tall to be a deer, and its proportions were off. It stood perfectly still, facing our approaching car, and even from a distance I could see that its posture was unusual. "Lisa," I said, gently shaking her awake. "Look at this." She opened her eyes and looked ahead. "What is that? A deer?" "I don't think so." I slowed the car to about 20 miles per hour, my high beams illuminating the figure more clearly. What I saw made my hands tighten on the steering wheel. The creature was standing on its hind legs like a person, but its body was wrong. Too long, too angular. Its front legs, or arms, hung at its sides in a way that looked almost human, but the proportions were grotesque. The head was tilted slightly, watching us approach with what seemed like intelligence. "That's not a deer," Lisa whispered. "What the hell is that?" I was now about 50 feet away and still approaching slowly. The creature's eyes reflected my headlights like an animal's, but there was something disturbingly aware in its gaze. It wasn't the blank stare of a deer caught in headlights. It was studying us. Then, without warning, it moved. But instead of running into the forest like any normal animal would, it dropped down to all fours and sprinted directly toward our car. Not away from us, toward us. The speed was impossible. One moment it was 50 feet away, the next it was bearing down on us like a nightmare. I slammed on the gas pedal, the car lurching forward as the engine roared. In my rearview mirror, I caught a glimpse of the creature as it reached the spot where we'd just been. It had stopped and was standing upright again, watching us speed away. Did you see how it moved? Lisa was gripping the dashboard, her voice shaking. That wasn't natural. Nothing moves like that. I didn't respond because I was focused on getting us away from whatever we'd just encountered. My heart was pounding and I could feel sweat beading on my forehead, despite the cool mountain air. We drove in tense silence for the next 20 minutes, both of us constantly checking the mirrors. "We should report this," Lisa said finally. "Maybe it was a bear or something and it's injured or sick." But we both knew it wasn't a bear. Bears don't stand upright like that, and they certainly don't charge toward moving vehicles. Whatever we'd seen was something else entirely. When we finally reached a gas station about 30 miles down the road, we were both shaken. I filled up the tank while Lisa went inside to buy coffee and calm her nerves. While I was pumping gas, an older local man approached me. "You folks coming from up the mountain?" he asked, nodding toward the road we'd just traveled. "Yeah. Why?" He looked at our car, then at me, and I could see he was evaluating whether to say something. "You see anything strange up there? On the road?" Lisa came out of the gas station at that moment, carrying 2 cups of coffee. "Strange how?" she asked. The man hesitated, then said, "There's been reports lately. Drivers seeing things on that stretch of road. Things that look like animals, but aren't. Game wardens don't know what to make of it. What kind of things? I asked, though I was pretty sure I already knew. Creatures that stand like people, but run like animals. They say some of the old Ute people called them skin changers. Most folks just call them not right. Lisa and I exchanged glances. Has anyone been hurt? She asked. Not yet, but a few cars have swerved trying to avoid them and ended up in ditches. Whatever they are, they're not afraid of vehicles like normal animals should be. He paused, studying our expressions. You did see something, didn't you? I nodded. Something was standing in the road. When we got close, it charged at us. The man's expression grew serious. You were smart to drive through. Don't ever stop for them, no matter what they look like. And don't take that road at night anymore, if you can help it. We thanked him and got back on the highway, taking the long way back to Denver on well-lit, busy roads. Neither of us slept well for weeks afterward, and we've never taken that scenic route again, especially not at night. I've done research since then and found dozens of similar reports from drivers on Colorado mountain roads. Creatures that look like deer or elk from a distance, but when approached, reveal themselves to be something much more disturbing. Animals that behave with intelligence, that seem to understand vehicles and traffic patterns. The most unsettling thing about our encounter wasn't what we saw. It was the feeling that we were being hunted, that whatever stood in that road wasn't there by accident. It was waiting for something. And when we appeared, it saw us as either prey or a threat worth chasing. I still drive mountain roads, but I'm much more cautious now. And if I ever see anything standing in the road ahead that doesn't look quite right, I'm not slowing down to get a better look. Some things are better left as mysteries, observed from a safe distance while moving at highway speeds. I've lived on my ranch in rural Nevada for over 20 years, and I thought I'd seen every kind of wildlife this desert had to offer. Coyotes, mountain lions, the occasional black bear wandering down from the mountains. I'd dealt with them all, but nothing in my experience prepared me for what started happening in the fall of 2020. My property sits about 60 miles northeast of Reno, in the high desert where the sagebrush stretches for miles in every direction. It's isolated, which is exactly how I like it. The nearest neighbor is 8 miles away, and I can go weeks without seeing another person if I choose to. I raise cattle and horses, and I've always prided myself on being able to handle whatever problems came up on my own. The first sign of trouble came on a Tuesday night in late September. I was sitting on my porch after dinner, enjoying the cool desert evening, when I heard something that made my blood run cold. It was the sound of animals screaming. Not the normal sounds you hear from coyotes or other predators, but something else entirely. High-pitched, almost human-like screams that seemed to go on forever. I grabbed my flashlight and rifle and went to check on my livestock. The horses were agitated, crowded together in the far corner of the pasture, their ears back and eyes rolling white. The cattle were similarly spooked, huddled together and making low, nervous sounds. But I couldn't find any source for the screaming. It seemed to be coming from the darkness beyond my property line. The screaming stopped abruptly around midnight, leaving an eerie silence that felt somehow worse than the noise had been. I stayed up the rest of the night, keeping watch from my porch with my rifle across my knees, but nothing else happened. The next few nights were quiet, and I started to convince myself it had been a mountain lion or some other predator I wasn't familiar with. But then it happened again, this time closer to the house. It was a Friday night, and I'd gone to bed early after a long day of fence repairs. Around 2 a.m., I was awakened by that same horrible screaming, but now it sounded like it was coming from right outside my bedroom window. I grabbed my gun and crept to the window, carefully peeling back the curtain. What I saw in the moonlight still gives me nightmares. There was something moving near my front gate, about 100 yards from the house. At first glance, it looked like a large wolf or coyote, but as I watched, it stood up on its hind legs and approached the gate. It moved with a fluid, unnatural grace, and when it reached the gate, it did something that made my skin crawl. It grabbed the metal gate with what looked like hands, not paws, but long, thin fingers that wrapped around the bars with unmistakably human dexterity. Then it began shaking the gate violently, the metal clanging and rattling in the still night air. The sound echoed across the desert like a death knell, but the worst part was the sound it made while shaking the gate. It wasn't growling or snarling like an animal. It was laughing, a low, throaty chuckle that sounded disturbingly human, but with an undertone that was purely predatory. I fumbled for my rifle, hands shaking as I tried to get a clear shot through the window. But by the time I had the weapon ready, the thing had dropped back down to all fours and was loping away into the darkness with movements that no natural animal should possess. I didn't sleep the rest of that night. At first light, I went out to examine the gate and found clear evidence of what I'd witnessed. The metal bars had deep scratches and gouges, and there were handprints in the dust around the gate posts. Handprints that were too large and too elongated to be human, but too human-like to be from any animal I knew of. The attacks on my livestock started the next week. I began finding dead animals on my property, not killed in any way that made sense for a normal predator. The wounds were precise and surgical, as if something with intelligence had been experimenting. Coyotes and mountain lions kill to eat, but whatever was doing, this seemed to be killing, for sport or study. One morning I found one of my horses dead near the water trough. The animal showed no signs of struggle, no defensive wounds, nothing that would indicate it had fought for its life. But there were marks on its neck that looked like they'd been made by human fingers, and its eyes had been removed with surgical precision. That's when I decided to set up surveillance cameras around my property. The footage I captured over the next few weeks was the most disturbing thing I've ever seen. Night after night, the cameras recorded shapes moving through my property with purposes that seemed almost ritualistic. They moved between the buildings, examined my equipment, and spent long minutes studying my house from different angles. But the most unnerving footage was from the camera I'd positioned near the gate. Night after night, the same creature would appear. Sometimes it approached on all fours like a wolf. Other times it walked upright like a person. It would spend hours at the gate, testing the latch, examining the hinges, running those long fingers along the metal bars, while making soft sounds that the camera's audio barely picked up. Sounds that were almost like conversation, as if it was talking to itself or to something I couldn't see. On the night of October 31st, Halloween, which now seems grimly appropriate, the creature finally managed to get the gate open. I was watching the live feed from my security system when I saw it happen. The creature had been working at the latch for nearly an hour when it suddenly figured out the mechanism. The gate swung open silently, and the thing stood there for a moment looking directly at the camera. Even through the grainy night vision footage, I could see it was smiling. That's when I heard the soft laughter coming from somewhere in the darkness outside my house. I grabbed my rifle and every light I could find, flooding my property with illumination. I could see movement in the shadows beyond the reach of my lights. Multiple shapes now, not just one. They seemed to be circling the house, staying just outside the range of visibility. The laughter continued, coming from different directions, sometimes seeming to come from right next to the house, other times from the barn or the equipment shed. It was like they were playing a game, testing me, seeing how far they could push before I broke. I called the sheriff's department, but the nearest deputy was over an hour away. I was on my own. The siege lasted until dawn. They never tried to break into the house, but they made their presence known all night long, scratching at the walls, rattling doorknobs, tapping on windows. The psychological warfare was more effective than any physical attack could have been. When the sun came up, they were gone. But the message was clear. They could get to me anytime they wanted. I sold the ranch 3 weeks later. I've moved to a small town outside Reno now, where there are neighbors close by and streetlights and all the comforts of civilization. I've told myself I'm retired, that I was ready for a change anyway. But the truth is, I was driven from my own land by something I can't explain and don't want to understand. Sometimes, late at night in my new house, I still hear that soft laughter in my dreams. And I know that somewhere out in the Nevada desert, they're still out there, waiting for the next person who thinks they can live alone in the wilderness. Some places belong to things that were there long before we arrived, and they don't appreciate visitors who stay too long.